Everyone to Australia at home goes to church, and happy Easter, everyone. My name is Brad. I'm coming to you from Ghana land. I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and I acknowledge the ongoing injustice caused by dispossession and paternalism. We're going to hear a bit more from First Nations leader Grant Paulson for a more formal acknowledgement of country shortly, but just first some housekeeping. We've found that these events can feel a lot more personal and connected if you keep the gallery view on, and that's if you can click that on a little button in the top right hand corner of your screen. It's fantastic to see each other's faces. There's a chat function that you can use to share your thoughts, and later on in our conversation I'll give some people some opportunities to ask questions too, which you can put up in the chat. Please keep in mind that this is intended as a safe conversation for people of all faiths and no faith, and also for people of all gender, sexuality, cultures, and anything outside those boundaries of safety isn't acceptable in this chat. Also note that this will be recorded for others to enjoy afterwards. You might have seen Hannah already post in the chat. She's there to offer tech support, so feel free to private message her if you have any problems. Now, the idea of this will be to spend around an hour together, but I have a feeling it might be a little bit longer. We've got 6 amazing people to talk to, so it might go a little bit longer than an hour, but please feel free to engage as much as is beneficial and interesting to each of you. Before we go any further, let me introduce to you Grant Paulson. He's a Bira and Bundjalung man and World Vision's Faith and Development Advisor for Australia programs. He'll formally acknowledge the country we're on wherever we are this Easter. Over to you, Grant.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Got a thumbs up there from some of you. Look, this afternoon I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and elders of the land where we connect from today. Knowing that we are all on ancestral land somewhere, even where we are around the world, we are on a place that was originally used and stewarded by another people. We do this tradition in contemporary Australian society as an expression of our desire for reconciliation and a better tomorrow. Historically, it was how we showed respect when we were moving from one land to another. But today we want to acknowledge the traditional custodians as an expression of hope, as expression of the kingdom come that we aspire for justice in the land, because that's what Easter is all about. The hope that Christ gives to overcome the grave, to overcome the gap between us and God, but also overcome the injustice gap between the rich, the poor, the slave, the free, the male, the female, the haves and the haves not. This kingdom come that Christ wants to bring in also. That is my aspiration for today as we acknowledge people, acknowledge the country of the traditional owners, but also as we take this expression of kingdom values and open our conversation up with it this afternoon. Amen.
Thank you so much, Grant. Thank you. Before I introduce our esteemed panelists, like the church services in the various traditions I've been a part of over the years, I thought we might start with a song. So I'm going to hand over to Liv and her partner, Chelsea. Liv is the worship coordinator at my church, Activate in Adelaide. And they're going to lead us in a little song, and I'll put the lyrics up in the chat so you can follow or even sing along if you'd like.
Thanks, Brad, and hello, everyone. Like Brad said, my name's Liv, and this is my partner, Chelsea. Like Brad, we're coming to you all from Ghana land in our little home here in Adelaide. We'll be singing a song this morning that is called Beautiful Things by an artist called Gungor. And so I invite you, like Brad said, sing along if you feel comfortable, or just please use this time as an opportunity to reflect and just listen to these really beautiful lyrics. God and come out from this ground at all. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of the dust. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of us. All around, hope is springing up from this old ground. Out of chaos, life is being found in you. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of the dust. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of us. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of the dust. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of us. You make me new. You are making me new. You make me new. You are making me new. You make me new. You are making me new. You make me new. You are making me new. You make me new. You are making me new. You make me new. You are making me new. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of the dust. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of us. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of the dust. You make beautiful things. You make beautiful things out of us.
Thank you so much, Liv and Chelsea. Really appreciate you joining us and sharing with us this morning. Thank you. So now we'll meet our panelists with just a quick bio for each of them so we can get into the meat of this discussion. After I introduce each of you, maybe you just give a quick answer to the question, what are you doing on this very different Easter Sunday? First up, we have Reverend Tim Costello AO in his second Australia at Home appearance. As you would probably know, he is the former CEO and Chief Advocate of World Vision. He's the Executive Director of MICA Australia, the Chair of the Community Council for Australia, who are one of our fantastic Australia at Home partners, and the Senior Fellow for the Centre for Public Christianity. Tim, what are you doing on this very different Easter?
Well, like all of you, I'm at home. I've got a beach in front of me, so I'm in isolation at a beach because I live in Frankston. For those of you who know Melbourne, glorious Frankston, home of cash converters and tattoo parlours, but a beach, a wonderful beach. And I can walk that, and now I can even swim that. So I'm actually quite enjoying this Easter Sunday.
Thanks. And Justine Toh is the Senior Fellow at the Centre for Public Christianity and occasional guest host of ABC RN's God Forbid, among other things. Justine, what are you up to today?
Hi, everyone, and hi, Brad. Thank you for having me as part of this wonderful gathering. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to find the sun. I feel quite cold at the moment. And So I'm just trying to creep into the sun as, you know, the day goes on. And we're at home, working from home, trying to keep my children entertained, taking them out briefly in the park. That, you know, if we sit down to have afternoon tea, and I'm always on the lookout for the cop car to kind of come toward us, and then I'm ready to get everyone to scramble and run away. But yeah, I'm just doing like every other regular kind of, I guess, family member in this time, just trying to spend the time together, enjoy it. Also just find pockets of time to reflect on this very unusual time, and how no one saw this coming, right? But yeah, we'll just get through it as best we can.
Thanks, Justine. Dr. Shane Clifton is a theologian and ethicist and an honorary associate with the Centre for Disability Research and Policy at the University of Sydney. Dr. Shane, tell us about your day.
Hi, Brad. Well, like Tim, I'm fortunate. I live in Wollongong, so I have a view of the beach. I'll look at the beach. And look, I have adult, like 20-year-old kids, and we're going to do an Easter egg hunt through our house. And we will have a barbecue lunch. So it'll be a nice family day.
Wonderful. Reverend Dr. Josephine Inkman is Australia's first openly transgender priest, a lecturer in theology at St. Francis College, Brisbane, a national board member of Equal Voices, a long-time social justice advocate, and a former officer of the National Council of Churches in Australia. Reverend Dr. Joe, what have you up to?
I'm enjoying this beautiful space that I'm in, the Turrbal and Jagera lands on which I live, and I've got a beautiful view out of the window of Mount Coota, honeybee dreaming territory, and trying to enjoy this space and not think too much about my children and family who are a little bit further south. I'm a little bit separated from them, but I hope to connect with them by Zoom later on.
Thank you. And you already met Grant Paulson quickly, but what are you up to today, Grant?
I'm trying to find the unmute button and looking like I'm across all of this. Look, I've just spent the morning online with church and eating chocolate and cappuccinos, as you do. Chocolate and cappuccinos in your lounge room, I think, is the way of worship in the future, I think. So, yeah. I think I might be tempted to go to church online, but there's no guarantee I'll be on time for that either. So, yeah.
Thanks, Grant. Well, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Brad Chilcott. I'm the former lead pastor of Activate Church, which is a faith community of activists in Adelaide. Among other things, I'm an associate director at Essential, who are one of the key drivers of the Australia at Home project. The director, Pete Lewis, is with us today. This was his baby and idea. And our other partners are Principal Co, the Centre for Australian Progress, the Guardian, the Community Council for Australia, the Australian Conservation Foundation, and the Centre for Policy Development. So this has been a way of kind of gathering civil society daily at 1 o'clock to work out what's going on in this crazy mixed up world that we're in at the moment, but also to inspire and motivate and mobilize to make sure that the people who are getting most screwed by all of this have people fighting on their behalf and organizing for them. What I've been doing today, well, our neighbours across the road decided that they would do a surprise Easter egg hunt for our kids. Overnight, they hid a whole bunch of eggs around our front yard, and our kids went out in their dressing gowns and found them, so that was fun. Then we had our Activate gathering online, and you might have seen that I had a Guardian piece this morning, which leads into our first item for discussion today. I guess one of my biggest frustrations is a Christian faith that is focused more on religious expression, as though religious expression is an end in itself. The amount of effort and creativity that I've seen churches putting into working out how to gather has been massive. And of course, it's still important for churches to get together and to connect, but we are surrounded now by suffering people who need people to reach out, to put others first, to think beyond themselves and their comfort. And so for me, a faith that's about making the faithful comfortable first and thinking about other people second is problematic. and doesn't look much like the Jesus that we're actually thinking about at Easter time. So I want to ask our panel, what do you think the role of faith in times of crisis should be? And we're going to throw to Tim Costello first to answer this.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I think Christian faith, if I can talk about that as a Christian minister, was born out of crisis. We forget that the cross was an instrument of power, an instrument of torture, an instrument of eliminating people who did not salute Rome or did not salute religious leaders at the time. And in that crisis, we actually understand a message that I have always understood but not always lived by, that God is on the side of the weakest, the most vulnerable, the most despised. Slaves were often the ones who died on crosses. So to say that the Son of God has died on a cross really was to remove all human notions of superiority and inferiority. And we humans all like a story to tell about ourselves, why we're superior. I think we do need tribes. Tribes right through history have been the mob we belong to, who we feel comfortable with, who get our humour. And that human need for a tribe often produces a need for superiority, why our tribe is better than others, why we have a story to tell ourselves which is superior. When Christian faith loses its focus on all are equal, all have dignity because all are made in the image of God, neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, no patriarchy, male over female, it loses its true essence to religious ritual and compliance. So for me, faith in time of crisis is saying this virus hits Boris Johnson and Tom Hanks and Peter Dutton. It's not discriminating. However, we know that social physical distancing is only a luxury of those who have houses, or economies like Australia, physical distancing for the poor in a slum in Africa or a refugee camp, or the lockdown in India. Talking to my Indian friends, stay at home in India is an order to starve. So the indiscriminate nature of the virus doesn't impact all indiscriminately, and yet they carry the dignity of being made in the image of God. So for me, the cross, Easter, stands for faith, that sort of faith, to look out for those people.
Thanks, Tim. Justine, you had a piece on the ABC opinion pages this week about Stoicism, and mentioning that Easter might show us a different path through the crisis than Stoicism does. Can you talk to that for a second for us?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So I was looking at Stoicism, and particularly the way that it's been taken up as a life hack among people in Silicon Valley particularly. But I was just trying to tease out how Stoicism seems to present a particular picture of the world that where it's wise, it's probably the wisest choice to sort of keep yourself slightly at a distance from the world and from others and from the pain of others. Doesn't mean that you aren't kind to them, that you try and help them out if you can, but you're not necessarily, you don't want to become unmoored by other people's suffering. And yet the Christian story, especially, you know, at Easter time, the Christian story of a God who involves himself in the world, who isn't afraid to get down with people in their misery, to meet them in their suffering, and then to die for them, essentially. I think that's a really powerful contrast in how it presents a God who took on flesh and who identified with people to the lowest point possible. And so I just thought it's something that's just, it presents an interesting contrast to one of the other philosophies, I suppose, that is having a bit of a revival in the world today. And I just think it's worth, I guess, unfolding the logic of the philosophies or the religions that we are interested in, because I think that the Christian story takes you very quickly to all the stuff that Tim's just said about standing in solidarity with the weak and promoting the dignity of everyone, regardless of how rich they are, how poor they are, anything really. So I just think it's a really powerful reminder for us, particularly in these times.
Thanks so much. Does anyone else from our panel want to jump in on this topic? Yeah, Joe, over to you.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about, I'm impressed by the amount of ingenuity and energy it's gone into, you know, replicating services and things, and some people have done that beautifully. I think that is about anchoring people, and I guess that's part of the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, has that historic thing, and I think that's part of what people are trying to maintain. But so I've been struck by the way in which, and not least actually even in cathedrals, which can often do live worship a little bit better than some other places, it's sort of like ghosts really in this sort of, and these old buildings, most of which have been shut up. And it struck me that, you know, for decades we've talked, or lots of theologians talked about a post-Constantinian church, you know, going back from the great reversal really from the early church. And I think the buildings and the basilicas and all that sort of stuff, a lot of that sort of stands for that sort of religious trappings and things. Now, some of that, to say, I think is about anchoring, and I think there is something about beauty as well as justice that needs to be maintained. But I think we're challenged. The Archbishop of Canterbury talked about, when they closed the churches in England, about being a different kind of church. And I don't think that means just using online resources. I think it's about what kind of a church we want to be. This is an opportunity, as it were, a challenge for a different kind of a spirit. So for me, it's interesting. We've got a family in our congregation who from Italy, and obviously they've got a lot of trauma and tragedy connected to people they know in Italy, because it's been so awful there. And they were bemoaning the fact that, because they're Catholic background, that they weren't able to get the mass. But we just sort of pointed out to them that they, you know, maybe the bread and wine, the food that they shared and the things they were doing were in themselves Eucharistic, if you like, that they were where God was present. And it was like a light bulb went on, and they said, oh, so we're like a little church then. And that's it, isn't it? We're going, in a sense, recovering some of that dynamic, I think, in the early church, of that where originally the church was household-based and connected in that way, rather than the big performance stuff. So maybe some of that will come back in the future, but I hope that some of the lessons we learn about being church in a new way, and we can't just go back, and might be the way forward for us. So we're doing faith differently, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think Shane put your hand up. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, look, I guess just extending that, I guess we've got an opportunity to think about the object of faith. Faith itself is sort of a nebulous term. We use it as though we've all talking about the same thing, but the really interesting thing to reflect on is, what is the object of faith? What's the nature of the God in which you have faith in? And of course, that's what's so challenging about the Easter event. Easter is a symbol of the nature of God. Doesn't give us, you know, this super powerful King God. It gives us quite a different picture of God. So, what's the object of the faith that we believe in? And I think, yeah, maybe an event like COVID just gives us all a chance to rethink. You know, the object of the faith in which we've been engaging, whether that's through our church services or through our, you know, in the way in which we've engaged our families or our workplaces. COVID-19, as horrible and terrible as it is, especially outside of Australia, like every event of difficulty and hardship, is also an opportunity to rethink what faith means, what life means, etc.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. Did I see you put your hand up, Grant? Yep, over to you, mate.
Apologies for the time lag on the mute button. I'm just conscious that the fact that in Aboriginal society, it's not faith in it as much as it's a spiritual connectivity to all things, to all people, to all places, to all time and all history, not so much in a lineal fashion, but in a holistic, seasonal, cyclical organism that holds us all together. My sense is that faith communities has the potential to embody and proclaim those sacred drivers that enable us to realise our better selves. Those sacred drivers for social change, I guess that's what I'm interested in as somebody who works in the development space, to be able to engage in a way that looks at my community and say, what are the sacred drivers that help us realise the healing and wholeness and the possibilities of what we can be, even in a post-colonial world. But I'm thinking in a in the midst of our postmodern global pandemic, our discovery of what the sacred drivers and vehicles, the narratives that call us to our best humanity in a time of fragmentation, in a time of disconnectedness, those sacred narratives that call us now. As a Christian, I would say that this Easter is a great opportunity to talk about the risen Christ that calls us into new beginnings, new possibilities. But I don't own, as a Christian, I don't own the franchise of hope, and I don't own the franchise on possibilities and newness. That thing jumps outside of my tradition and speaks out through the ancient tradition of my ancestors as well. So I'm finding, if you can find a sacred driver that calls you to your best humanity, that reminds you of your connectedness to all things, to all people and all places, I think tap into that. And I think that's what faith communities have the potential to do for us as a community.
That's fantastic. Imagine if we all came out of this crisis looking to be the best version of ourselves, our deepest form of humanity, and looking to how we can share that humanity with others. This week, I'm sure many of us were shocked and rocked by the Cardinal Pell court finding. I'd recently watched the Revelation series on ABC. Actually, I finished it, I think, the day before the Pell verdict was handed down. And I saw Cardinal Pell this week saying he felt a bit like Jesus in regards to suffering and resurrection, and the Pope also seeming to suggest that Pell had a Jesus-like experience. To me, in the midst of the thousands upon thousands of people dying every day around the world and the untold millions losing their jobs and falling into poverty, this to me seemed massively tone deaf at best and at worst fairly narcissistic. So I'm interested in, what does the Easter narrative teach us about suffering? What can we learn about suffering? I'm going to throw to Shane to respond first.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of the potential hypocrisy of people talking about suffering, I think I'd put myself there. I have spent a lot of time thinking about suffering. I've experienced disability. There's a general assumption that disability and suffering go hand in hand, and I've actually learned that's not the case. I've learned that actually you can have a disability and live a flourishing and a blessed life, and I do feel blessed. So I guess the first thing I should say is I don't think I could call myself the expert on suffering, but to step back from that, the Easter event is, I think it is a time for us to think about God's choice to enter into suffering. And when I think of the Easter event and its relationship to suffering, I just can't get past a set of paradoxes. So there is the paradox of evil and goodness. In the Easter event, the suffering of Christ is an event of horrible evil that's done to Christ. It's completely unjust. And yet God also brings good out of this evil event. I think of the paradox of ugliness and beauty. When you see suffering, it is awful and horrible to look at, and the crucifixion is an ugly event, and yet it's also an event that somehow God's able to bring beauty out of the midst of that. I was sent from a friend recently, in fact, just a piece of art from Michelangelo, and it was just a carving he'd done of the dead Christ being carried out of the cross by Mary Magdalene and the mother of Jesus, and just the beauty that is somehow apparent in this horrible, ugly death of Christ. And I guess the same thing goes with meaning. There is, in a sense, suffering is meaningless and awful, and yet God is able to invest what's meaningless with deep meaning. And so in the tiny bits of suffering that I've had, I've experienced some of the beauty that comes out of that, some of the meaning that can be invested in that. And if you are interested just in doing any reading on that, I'd recommend to you Julia Baird's recent book that just came out a few weeks ago, Phosphorescence. Really beautiful examination of beauty in the context of difficult times. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Shane. Why don't we hear from Reverend Dr. Joe on this as well?
You beat me to it there, Shane. I was going to mention Julia's book as well. But I resonate with what you say about suffering as a trans person as well, because often we're thought of as, we're treated as people who've got problems and everything. And there is a lot of distress and everything in the community, but often it's been caused by other people's attitudes. So I think it's about how we approach suffering. And for me, there are probably three things in that. First of all, one of my mentors, who used to be Dean of St. Paul's years ago, he used to say that the cross comes when we try to change things. And I think that's fundamental to the gospel narrative. But often we've made it sort of a passive thing of how we bear suffering, when in fact what Jesus was doing, in a non-violent way, was actually about transformation. So the cross came when he actually did things. It actually picks up what Tim was saying about the nature of the cross and its solidarity with the poor and the struggles of the world and the struggle for justice. So that is a lot of what I think gospel suffering was actually about, rather than a lot of the other stuff, which was about consecrating suffering, which a lot of sexually and gender diverse people, and women particularly, and other marginalised people, Aboriginal people and others, have suffered because we've been told that you have to put up with this stuff. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, is to look again at, well, where is suffering? Who is the people to speak about suffering? And then usually the people who are in the powerful positions who interpret other people's suffering. And in transgender theology, one of the interesting things is the way we are reclaiming by reading the Bible. The story of Job, for instance, where Job is told his suffering, or their suffering, because who knows, maybe they were a non-binary person, that their suffering is interpreted by other people, but they're not actually allowed to speak for themselves. So we don't hear Job's story. And so it's about, I think we need to shift into that, of actually listening to those people who are actually enduring or overcoming suffering themselves, rather than those who are in powerful positions. And I do that a lot myself, interpreting other people, but we need to learn to keep silent. And then the third thing I think is that suffering is suffering. That's just part of our human existence. And I've written a piece today actually about the way in which we can sometimes jump straight to Easter and straight into joy. I don't think we can do that so easily. Maybe that's one of the things COVID-19 is challenged, to get over the comfortable, bunnies and chocolate stuff and everything else, and we can forget about the cross. When in fact the cross and the resurrection are always together. So whenever we experience resurrection, and usually it's often the marginalised, suffering people of the world who speak most powerfully of that it's out of a situation of the cross. But vice versa, the cross, any suffering we have can be transcended by the light of God. So for me as an English person in my background, I've always been struck by some of the poetry that's come out of the First World War, for instance. A wonderful priest, Jeffrey Studdert Kennedy, who had these rough rhymes, and he talked about peace being not something that was the end of things in our lifetime anyway, this side of death, but was not the end of our striving, but was the joy of arriving up to the place where God's grace was to be found. And I think that's what the Easter message is about, that we find our peace not in trying to deny suffering, and certainly not the suffering of others, but by entering into it in a way that enables us to experience the joy and the grace of God. And that enables us to share peace, but not a peace that, it might be the peace that passes all understanding, but it's not a peace that is ever going to be fully resolved in this world.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you. I'm going to go to our next question, but we can still address this topic of suffering as we go. Often in the media, what we see is not reflective of the beauty and charity and generosity that we see across people of faith and people of Christian faith. But we have seen a lot of coverage of things like child abuse through the Royal Commission, but also things like the pastor in America willing to be arrested so that he can have thousands of people at his conference while we're supposed to be self-isolating, or Christians spreading anti-scientific, anti-inclusion and anti-justice propaganda is often what ends up in the media. So while I know that there is so much good that people of faith do, it's easy to understand why many Australians and many people think, what's the point of all this anymore? Is the church even relevant today? So I want to ask the panel, what is the role of the church in modern Australia? And I particularly want to start with Grant, because First Nations people have such a complex relationship with the church. The church was responsible for so much pain and suffering, often directly involved in cultural genocide and in creating the stolen generations. And yet, like yourself, there are many First Nations Australians with a deep commitment to faith and to the church. So, Grant, what do you think of the church's role in modern Australia, and what should it be?
Great question. I think the role of the church in the current COVID-19 crisis is to rediscover its radical roots. It's and to rediscover its mandate that existed before all the trappings of culture, all the trappings of modernity, and all the trappings of partisan politics. To rediscover our call to the kingdom of God. It's talked about in Matthew 5, and the rediscovery of what it means to be the hands and feet in Christ in action. I think that naming and embodying of hope and the embodying of justice and mercy and grace is what people are hungry for. It's ironic that this message that got co-opted by the colonizers as a really good marketing tool to, quell the native, pacify the natives, is now in parts of the world the very message that the descendants of the original natives, colonized natives, are using to find hope, are using to rediscover the original gifts of God in the first place in language. Stan Grant Sr., Stan Grant, the media guy, his father, Uncle Stan Grant, was part of a Wiradjuri language program, rediscovering the language group and talking out with another, I think it was a Uniting Church minister, a linguist, and teaching that to the descendants of Wiradjuri. The irony of it is the source texts that they were using to rebuild and reconstruct the syntax and language was the biblical framework. In our history, we have a number of people that have made mistakes, but we also have a number of heroes of faith that have gone before and did radical things in the name of the gospel, in the name of justice. Reverend John Saunders, for example, Australia's first Baptist minister, was preaching about land rights and preaching about native title before any things had become part of a high court system that we have today. So my challenge to the people of faith, those who are, regardless of what flavour you come from, rediscover your radical roots and let's live that out in ways that make sense to people that are disconnected and isolated. Sorry, I turned into a Baptist preacher there for a minute.
No, that was fantastic. Do any one of our other panelists want to weigh in on this topic? What is the role of the church in modern Australia? Tim, you look like you want to speak. Go on.
Yeah.
Mate.
So I would say that the difficulty the church has, whether it's in Australia or in America, is that some of the crazies get the oxygen and the media gives them the oxygen. In America, I'm on the board of an outfit called Sojourners. Sojourners have convened for faith tables all the historic churches, Catholic, Orthodox, National Association of Evangelicals, think Billy Graham, National Council of Churches, and that faith table is absolutely solid in America, in churches staying closed, in physical distancing, and caring for neighbours. Absolutely the mobilised masses of Christians in America doing the right, sane, sensible, loving thing, and who gets the oxygen as some of the rusted on Trump crazies who are going to open their churches. I think sometimes the church in Australia suffers from a little bit of that. Thankfully, we don't quite have Fox News giving oxygen in the same way to some of those crazies, but I would say that most churches meeting week by week, caring for their neighbourhood, passing around the plate, responding to homeless and to lonely, actually a glue that is fundamentally important to Australia. I've said before that in fragmented times, we forget that when 7% of the population is meeting each week for a morally serious topic, we call it a sermon, to pass around the plate, to ask what can we do in our neighbourhood. That is fundamentally important, and the role of the church in Australia. Look, the only other thing I'd say theologically is those in what's often called the liberal church would say God's hands are only our hands, or his voice is only our voice. I think that, not counting myself in that group, that actually the church's job in Australia is to imagine a God who is still active, on the move, alive, inspiring, that God has agendas of care and inclusion for those who missed out, what the cross and Easter's about, that inspire my imagination. So the church's job is to keep alive the idea that there is a God who loves us, who's at work, who's active. Yes, uses our hands and legs, but is also imagining that God who wants the world to flourish. That's the job of the church in Australia.
Okay, Joe, quickly, and then we're going to get you to lead us in your first little prayer. So just respond to the question first, Joe.
I just wanted to add, it was what I was trying to say about post-Constantinian church. I think we're still a lot of church and church leaders, sadly, even in a nice mild way, are clinging to an imperial idea of church. And that's what we've got to let go of. And it's a mercy, for a lot of LGBTI people, this period. I mean, it's awful for a lot of us, for a lot of people, because they're plunged into isolation and mental health issues and everything else. But it's a mercy because we've stopped this persecution, driven largely by church leaders and certain politicians, to exclude us. But no one's asking now, who's teaching our kids online? Or who are the health people? Or who are the support people? What sexuality or gender have they got? And we're driven back to the fundamentals of what communion's really about, not about, what we do with bread and wine and how it works, but, how we connect together. Are we in this together? That's the big question. And I think what Tim has said, it's the ecumenical question that maybe God is asking us, what is it that we've got to give to one another, rather than, how we're going to compete with one another and beat up certain groups that we don't happen to like. So that probably leads into my prayer in a way.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So in just a moment, Joe is going to lead us in a prayer. I've just put the words up in the chat. It's call and response. You're on mute, so you can just respond in your own home. But after Joe's finished, we're going to open it up for some questions to our panelists. So this just will take a couple of moments, and then start writing your questions and we can respond. Over to you, Reverend Doctor.
Let us pray. Christ, our hope, the water of life, as we're encouraged to wash our hands at this time, wash us also with your love. Where there is fear and anxiety, wash your people with peace. Where there is selfishness and greed, wash your people with generosity. Where there is anger and mistrust, wash your people with faith. Where there is inequality and oppression, wash your people with justice. Where there is sorrow and grief, wash your people with joy. Where there is death and destruction, wash your people with hope. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Joe. So if you have any questions for our panel, please write them in the chat now. And fantastic. Ariane and Hannah will let me know. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question? Well, I have one of my own. So as I mentioned earlier, we have been gathering every day at 1 p.m. to gather with civil society, the progressive people in Australia who are trying to build a more just, equal and inclusive future for all. Sometimes it feels in that crowd like faith of any kind, and especially Christian faith, is not the, I don't know, you feel like you're the square peg in the round hole in that group sometimes. So I wonder if you have any response to that. Where does faith fit into civil society, to this move and this solidarity with people who are suffering and the organising required to create change? Any of our panelists want to respond? Justine, thanks.
Hi. I think that one thing that Christianity in particular can bring is something that Tim's already mentioned, that if everyone's made in the image of God, then there is a dignity and a worth and a value that isn't kind of determined by people, but is actually a marker of God's own light and dignity to that person. So I think that is an incredible kind of basis from which that establishes a foundation that makes us obliged to like love and care for each other, because we're loving God in doing that. I mean, Jesus also says, what you do for the least of them, you do for me. So in showing dignity to the marginalized, then we are showing dignity to Jesus. But we should be doing this obviously not just to get into Jesus's good books, but just because it is the right thing to do and because everyone's made in the image of God. And I think that the church issues a call of radical inclusion as well, right? But I also think it's important to say as well that I think embedded within that radical call to inclusion is a radical call itself. I mean, when my Easter service was streamed today, we looked at a passage where Jesus says, if you want to follow me, pick up your cross and come. And I find that a very challenging thing to even contemplate. If I was to even look in the mirror at myself and say, what cross do I need to pick up? What part of my life or what aspects of my of who I believe myself to be am I going to have to forsake in order to tread the path behind Jesus? And that is really a very challenging thing to do, and calls for personal sacrifice as well as, you know, sacrifices that may wind up leading toward a more just and equitable society. Because for those of us who have privileges, it's going to mean forsaking some of those privileges in order for others to benefit. So I think that that is a very unique kind of contribution that faith can bring to the sort of circles that you're talking about, because I wonder if sometimes in those circles, like the justice-oriented circles, there sometimes seems to be like, how about we try and maximize as much as possible freedom for everyone? And while I broadly agree with that principle, I also think that we're never in that space necessarily asking the question, what do I have to give up in order to maximize the freedom of other people, not just myself?
Yeah, I think, Shane, did you want to comment there?
Look, that's a rich comment, Justine. I guess I was just thinking differently about your original comment. I've spent 2 decades working in a theological college, which is essentially in a Christian. And then I've spent the last 6 months working with the Disability Royal Commission, which is essentially secular and a bit more left than certainly the theological college I was in. And I was expecting a fair bit of suspicion about theology. And look, what I've actually found is people are open. Once you can get past the fact that you're not part of the, you know, that sort of loud, vicious, anti-LGBT side of faith, people are interested in meaning, you know, in hearing stories of the gospel, because they generally don't know these stories anymore. They're less a common language. And so if you're speaking to people, just, you're not trying to convert anyone or, you know, but just to talk about meaning, then my experience is that, you know, people are open to those conversations, and Easter's a great time to have rich conversations with people.
Thanks, Shane, and thanks, Justine. We're going to go to a couple of questions from our vast congregation. Firstly, Tony Robertson is there with a question. Tony.
Thank you. I'm Catholic, and I've come to an understanding I can only truly be Catholic if I'm involved in an interfaith relationship with others in this country and community. So I'd like to hear from the panel, what is the future of interfaith relations, not just dialogue, but interfaith relations in our culture and community?
Who wants to answer that one? Tim?
I'll have a go.
Oh.
I think there's probably a number of things that are already happening. One, I think, is actually the contemplative dimension and religious or spiritual practice, I should say. And I think that's what Christianity has had to receive actually from Buddhism and others of how we deal and how we actually sustain justice actually through a deeper practice of prayer and contemplation, which actually takes us beyond words and doctrines. So I think that's sort of experiential level. I mean, you can argue about concepts, but I think that's one thing. The second thing I think is about sharing injustice. And above all, I think it's about the work of addressing issues to do with the planet and climate change. And so I think groups like Australian Religious Response to Climate Change and others, it's notable that is an interfaith group. And I think that movement may be perhaps the most important thing for interfaith dialogue to build on.
Thanks, Joe. Tim, over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks. Great question. So I think we haven't quite understood in Australia that the choice to be multicultural, which I affirm, is a profound choice to be multi-faith. There is no multiculturalism without the faiths that actually support those cultures. And I think we're still coming to terms with this, particularly with the trade-off that says, how do we acknowledge that a whole lot of the assumptions that we take for granted in our society have come to us from a Christian, Judeo-Christian ethic. Whether you're an atheist or a believer, you actually have a relationship with Christian assumptions. You may not be aware of them, but we certainly know that even take the issue of slavery when finally they turn up and write a treaty in Vienna and say, oh, we English have an electoral problem. Our people wanted slavery abolished, so we're going to impose this. There are a whole lot of other faiths that said, what? We don't actually understand that at all, but you're the great power, you're going to impose it. So there is still real tensions, and interfaith dialogue shouldn't ever minimize the fact that seeing the image of God in others, which is a particularly Christian idea from which dignity and human rights, in my argument, flow. Well, not just mine. Tom Holland, who's not a believer, has written a tour de force defending Christianity, saying the Enlightenment owes far more to Christian assumptions than anything in Greek or Roman world. So, yes, absolutely, interfaith is fundamental to coexisting in a multicultural world. The question is always what tugging of the forelock or nodding to the particular assumptions that have made even non-believers in Australia think about what is normal and what rights are, which may have a legacy in Christian faith. How do you, without privileging that, acknowledge that? So I see that as still being the tension in the discussions going on.
Thanks, Tim. We are going to go to Patrina Larson. Patrina.
Hi, everyone. So I'm always interested in the question of language, especially religious language in a secular context. And I've been hearing on Easter Sunday, we talk about the risen Christ, and I'm just interested in how what others think about the possibility of languaging that in a way that makes sense in a very secular world. What does language like the risen Christ mean to people who do not come from a church tradition? And is there a way of expressing that in such a way that we can have conversations about meaning making with people who are not already churched?
Who would like that one? Wave your hand. Come on, be brave. Justine.
I'm just going to take a stab. I'm wondering with the language, something like new creation has its own reverberations within the Christian story. And so it is kind of like jargon in that sense. But when the Apostle Paul says, if anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation, there's a sense there of starting again. And even if that has its own particular resonances within a Christian understanding, I think people can tap into that as well. And I wonder whether that might be an interesting way to think through or to interact with the environmental crisis as well, because everyone can see the destruction that's unfolding. We've just lived through the devastating bushfires, even though that feels really long ago, right, with all this going on. So I wonder if that can help to energize people's thinking in that particular area, but not in a way that says, oh, look, there's going to be a new creation, therefore let's just junk, like, you know, this world doesn't matter. No, it should actually empower and energize your efforts in this world, because you know that it's not all in vain, right? And yeah, so I've taken it a little bit far away from your risen Christ questions particularly, but I wonder if something to do with new creation can help.
Shane, you wanted to add something?
Oh, look, I guess, you know, if it's going to be a defensive debate about whether a particular event is literal or not, then it probably ends up with a pretty meaningless conversation. But I think if we can talk about resurrection in terms of its important symbols that something good can come out of death, then I think it's of great interest to everyone. You know, sometimes I think we get defensive and we end up sort of caught in conversations that are not going to go anywhere. So, you know, the resurrection surely is much more about meaning than it is a debate on historicity, for example. So let's have those conversations in ways that make sense to modern people.
Thanks, Shane. We're going to have one more question, and considering this is part of a series of gathering people from civil society and politics and progressive action, we're going to throw to Elise to kind of bring that topic back into the discussion. Elise Mesner, are you there?
Hello. Sorry, this is Will Mesner on Elise's account. Hello?
Yes, talk, Will. Go for it.
Hello. Sorry, this is Will on Elise's account. Yeah, so we've had a few mentions of Constantine, of the impact that missionaries had in colonization. And at Easter, we remember that the state actually killed Jesus at this time. And good and bad things have happened when Christians have engaged in politics and in statecraft in the past. Just wondering the panel's thoughts on whether Christians should participate in politics, and if so, how, and where are the limits to that?
Who wants that one?
Surely Tim better answer that one.
Tim, over to you.
I'm not sure why. There was another Costello in politics. This one never went in. Well, actually, I was in local government, so yes. Look, I think whether it's Christianity or any religion engaging with politics, the simple way to put it is politics and religion ask different questions. Politics asks the question, how do we live together? And you can only live together by compromise. Polis is the Greek word for city-state. They were multicultural with lots of different gods, and therefore to live together, they needed a politic of compromise. Religion generally says what is absolutely true, and you don't compromise what you believe is absolutely true. So as soon as religious people engage in politics, they're often seen standing above, wagging a finger, saying, if you all shut up and listen to me long enough, you'd know the truth. And you politicians have to legislate the truth, rather than, oh, how do I compromise and how do I live together? To answer your question, Will, yeah, of course, Christians not only should engage in politics, they actually engage probably in far greater proportion, maybe disproportionate influence if you look at our federal parliament and the numbers of politicians who actually have an active Christian faith. It is maybe unrepresentative of what the rest of Australia is. So the question, I don't think, is should you? It's the question of how do I accept that there won't be political decisions that I've compromised on that somehow render my faith obsolete or demand me to have a megaphone and shout them down. How do I actually live in those two worlds, what Augustine called the city of God and the secular world? And the city of God is eternal. The secular world of politics, whether it's empires or people, die. And they are part of the cycle of life. And compromises, once right, aren't right again. But the eternal world of religion is something that is different. We actually do have to approach our engagement that way, rather than we have the absolute truth.
Thanks. There's so many fantastic questions in the chat, but Joe, were you really keen to answer that one? No? You're just impressed by Tim's response?
No, I just wanted to come in because there was a question someone threw out about LGBTIQ people, and I do hope that out of this we will emerge in different situations. The best thing churches can do is to get rid of their own toxicity and to empower LGBTI Christians who are often quite alienated in LGBTIQ groups because of the toxicity we seem to, people think we're going to carry. So that's the best thing we can do, so that out of this thing, when we come out of this stuff, that we will stand together and we'll move beyond this nonsense of having to pick upon people. But we have to do a lot of internal work. And that's what this is the thing about the Pell stuff, isn't it? It's not Pell himself and all that, in his particular case. Will we finally deal with the seeds of darkness that are in our own church traditions? It goes across almost all of them. Even the MCC has a few little issues. That we have to deal with these big issues that are theological and historical, that we continue to empower issues. Until we do that, we won't move on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe. That was responding to a question from Jeeves. Thank you for doing that. And I think it relates back to something Justine said earlier about taking up our cross and giving up things ourselves. One thing we need to give up is our prejudice, our greed, our self-interest, our selfishness, our focus on what makes us comfortable, and start to live with true empathy for others. And if the church can give up its prejudice and its self-interest and greed, we'll be in a much better position. Quickly, Justine, we're going to wrap it up in a second. Go.
I know, and I hate to open the can of worms, but I'm really interested in what Joe said, and I just want to ask the question. Like, I've got a celibate gay Christian friend, and he often feels alienated by a church that worships family life, right, and heterosexual marriage. But he also, because he's chosen celibacy, he also feels he may find it toxic, in your words, to be in a space which is kind of challenging him from where he wants to live. So I guess what's the answer for him as well? I mean, I don't know if there's something that you can answer quickly, but I just thought it was worth raising. But I also know that I don't want to kind of hijack the events as well.
Go, Joe. Let's have a quick answer to that. Well, it's all about options, isn't it? And yeah, celibacy has has some difficult things, but it's an important tradition. I mean, through hundreds of years, it was the way women could have space, for God's sake, and not be oppressed by men so much. So it's an important thing, but it's only a part thing. So yes, I think that is something to value. But let's face it, most people aren't in that position. LGBTI people aren't, and we want to be able to express love and touch. For God's sake, we're struggling with that now. So yeah, we've got to work together. But it's not a case of this or that, celibacy or otherwise. But if you put all your eggs in one basket of, this group of people can only have sex this way, or only their bodies that way, you're in trouble. So I think, I think those things will resolve themselves once the barriers come down and the toxicity. So And it's quite painful to be in that situation. I feel for that person, as I do for a lot of LGBTI Christians who are caught in the crossfire.
Yeah, I think if we can all respect each other's choices and identities, then we all end up in a better place. So before I bid farewell and thank a few people, I'm going to let Joe lead us in a sending out prayer, a very short call and response again. You'll have the opportunity to read in the chat what you can say to your computer screen, if you like, and to the Lord. And the words are there now. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you. Yes, it's slightly curious because I can't hear any response or anything, but I hope you will join in, or at least read these, which are, again, trying like poetically, creatively to enter into the challenges of the time and find those words. It's part about exploring that question about, you know, how do we use the language? What is it to talk about resurrection to others? I hope this touches something in you and might touch other people and inspire you to do the same. Ever-loving God, touched by the light of new dawn, send us out to dispel the darkness. Reborn by your grace to new life, send us out to see and support you in the stranger. Nourished like seeds in rich earth, send us out to bring life to the world. Rejoicing that death could not hold you, send us out to bring joy to the sorrowing. Brushed by the wings of angels, send us out to proclaim the good news. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today, especially thank you to our panelists, Tim, Grant, Justine, Joe, and Shane. We really appreciate you and thank you for being with us. Our musicians, Liv and Chelsea, thank you for joining us on your couch and sharing with us. A massive thanks to Ariane and Hannah from Essential, who've been in the background managing the chat and the tech. Thank you. And a thank you to all our partners that I mentioned earlier, especially to The Guardian, who really helped promote Australia at Home throughout the week and also provide excellent coverage of all the things going on in our world. And if you're interested, Australia at Home continues every day at 1 p.m. We're back on Tuesday after the public holiday. We have Peter Lewis from Essential and Catherine Murphy from The Guardian, who will be nerding out on the latest opinion polls and happenings in politics. So you can register for those events at australiaathome.com.au. Thank you so much for being part of this. Again, to our panelists and everyone else for joining us. It was truly a pleasure. Happy Easter. Farewell.